This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of Holland by George Edmundson. Prologue. The title, History of Holland, given to this volume is fully justified by the predominant part which the great maritime province of Holland took in the War of Independence, and throughout the whole of the subsequent history of the Dutch state and people. In every language the country, comprising the provinces of Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Friesland, Gelderland, Overijssel and Groningen, has, from the close of the 16th century to our own day, been currently spoken of as Holland, and the people, with the solitary exception of ourselves, as Hollanders. It is only rarely that the terms of the Republic of the United Provinces, or of the United Netherlands, and, in later times, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, are found outside official documents, just as the title History of England gradually includes the histories of Wales, of Scotland, of Ireland, and finally of the widespread British Empire. So it is in a smaller way with the history that is told in the following pages. That history, to be really complete, should begin with an account of medieval Holland in the feudal times which preceded the Burgundian period, and such an account was indeed actually written, but the plan of this work, which forms one of the volumes of a series, precluded its publication. The character, however, of the people of the provinces of Holland, and of its sister and closely allied province of Zeeland, its qualities of toughness, of endurance, of seamanship and maritime enterprise, spring from that peculiar amphibious nature of the country, which differs from that of any other country in the world. The age-long struggle against the ocean and the river floods, which has converted the marshes that lay around the mouths of the Rhine, the Meuse and the Scheldt, by toilsome labour and skill into fertile and productive soil, has left its impress on the whole history of this people. Nor must it be forgotten how largely this building up of the elaborate system of dykes, dams and canals, by which this waterlogged land was transformed into the Holland of the closing decades of the 16th century, enabled her people to offer such obstinate and successful resistance to the mighty power of Philip II. The earliest dynasty of the Counts of Holland, Dirks, Floris and Williams, was a very remarkable one. Not only did it rule for an unusually long period, 922 to 1299, but, in this long period without exception, all the Counts of Holland were strong and capable rulers. The fiefs of the first two Dirks lay in what is now known as North Holland, in the district called Kennemerland. It was Dirk III who seized from the bishops of Utrecht some swampy land amidst the channels forming the mouth of the Meuse, which, from the bush which covered it, was named Hotland, Holland or Woodland. Here he erected in 1015 a stronghold to collect tolls from passing ships. This stronghold was the beginning of the town of Dordrecht, and from here, a little later, the name Holland was gradually applied to the whole country. Of his successors, the most illustrious was William II, 1234 to 1256, who was crowned King of the Romans at Aachen, and would have received from Pope Innocent IV the imperial crown at Rome, had he not been unfortunately drowned while attempting to cross on horseback an icebound marsh. In 1299 the male line of this dynasty became extinct, and John of Avesnes, Count of Hainault, nephew of William II, succeeded. His son, William III, after a long struggle with the Counts of Flanders, conquered Zeeland and became Count henceforth of Holland, Zeeland and Hainault. His son, William IV, died childless, and the succession then passed to his sister Margaret, the wife of the Emperor Louis of Bavaria. It was contested by her second son William, who, after a long drawn-out strife with his mother, became in 1354 Count of Holland and Zeeland, with the title William V. Margaret retaining the country of Hainault. Becoming insane, his brother Albert in 1358 took over the reins of government. In his time the two factions, known by the nickname the Hooks and the Cods, kept the land in a continual state of disorder and practically of civil war. They had already been active for many years. The Hooks were supported by the nobles, by the peasantry, and by that large part of the poorer townsfolk that was excluded from all share in the municipal government. The Cods represented the interest of the powerful burgher corporations. In later times these same principles and interests divided the Oranje and the States parties, and were inherited from the Hooks and Cods of medieval Holland. The marriage of Albert's son William with Margaret, the sister of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, and of John the Fearless with Albert's daughter Margaret, were to have momentous consequences. Albert died in 1404 and was succeeded by William VI, who before his death in 1417 caused the nobles and towns to take the oath of allegiance to his daughter and only child Jacoba or Jacqueline. Jacoba, brave, beautiful and gifted, for 11 years maintained her rights against many adversaries, chief among them her powerful and ambitious cousin, Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. Her courage and many adventures transformed her into a veritable heroine of romance. By her 3 marriages to John, Duke of Brabant, with Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and finally with Frans van Borselen, she had no children. Her hopeless fight with Philip of Burgundy's superior resources ended at last in the so-called Reconciliation of Delft in 1428, by which, while retaining the title of Countess, she handed over the government to Philip and acknowledged his right of succession to the countship upon her death, which took place in 1436. G.E. November 1921. End of Prologue. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of Holland by George Edmundson. Chapter 1. The Burgundian Netherlands. The last Duke of the ancient Carpathian House of Burgundy dying in 1361 without heirs male, the duchy fell into the possession of the French crown, and was by King John II bestowed upon his youngest son Philip the Hardy, Duke of Touraine, as a reward, it is said, for the valour he displayed in the battle of Poitiers. The county of Burgundy, generally known as Franche-Comté, was not included in this donation, for it was an imperial fief, and it fell by inheritance in the female line to Margaret, Dowager Countess of Flanders, widow of Count Louis II, who was killed at Crécy. The duchy and the county were soon, however, to be reunited, for Philip married Margaret, daughter and heiress of Louis de Male, Count of Flanders, and granddaughter of the above-named Margaret. In right of his wife he became, on death of Louis de Male in 1384, the ruler of Flanders, Mechlin, Artois, Nevers, and Franche-Comté. Thus the foundation was laid of a great territorial domain between France and Germany, and Philip the Hardy seems from the first to have been possessed by the ambitious design of working for the restoration of a powerful middle kingdom, which should embrace the territories assigned to Lothaire in the tripartite division of the Carolingian Empire by the Treaty of Verdun, 843. For this he worked ceaselessly during his long reign of 40 years, and with singular ability and courage. Before his death he had, by the splendour of his court, his wealth, and his successes in arms and diplomacy, come to be recognized as a sovereign of great weight and influence, in all but name a king. The Burgundian policy and tradition which he established found in his successors John the Fearless, murdered in 1419, and John's son Philip the Good, men of like character and filled with the same ambitions as himself. The double marriage of John with Margaret, the sister of William VI of Holland, and of William VI with Margaret of Burgundy, largely helped forward their projects of aggrandisement. Philip the Good was, however, a much abler ruler than his father, a far-seeing statesman who pursued his plans with patient and unscrupulous pertinacity, of which a conspicuous example is to be found in his long protracted struggle with his cousin Jacoba, the only child and heiress of William of Holland, whose misfortune and courage have made her one of the most romantic figures of history. By a mixture of force and intrigue Philip in 1433 at last compelled Jacoba to abdicate, and he became Count of Holland, Zeeland and Hainault. Nor was this by any means the end of his acquisitions.
Joanna, Duchess of Brabant (1355 to 1404), in her own right was aunt on the mother's side to Margaret of Flanders, wife of Philip the Hardy. Dying without heirs, she bequeathed Brabant, Limburg and Antwerp to her great nephew Anthony of Burgundy, younger brother of John the Fearless. Anthony was killed at Agincourt, and was succeeded first by his son John IV, the husband of Jacoba of Holland, and on his death, without an heir in 1427, by his second son Philip of St. Pol, who also died childless in 1430. From him his cousin Philip the Good inherited the duchies of Brabant and Limburg, and the marquisate of Antwerp. Already he had purchased in 1421 the territory of Namur from the last Count John III, who had fallen into heavy debt, and in 1443 he likewise purchased the Duchy of Luxemburg from the Duchess Elizabeth of Görlitz, who had married in second wedlock Anthony, Duke of Brabant, and afterwards John of Bavaria, but who had no children by either of her marriages. Thus, in 1443, Philip had become, by one means or another, sovereign under various titles of the largest and most important part of the Netherlands, and he increased his influence by securing, in 1456, the election of his illegitimate son, David, as Bishop of Utrecht. Thus a great step forward had been taken for the restoration of the Middle Kingdom, which had been the dream of Philip the Hardy, and which now seemed to be well nigh on the point of accomplishment. The year 1433, the date of the incorporation of Holland and Zeeland in the Burgundian dominion, is therefore a convenient starting point for a consideration of the character of the Burgundian rule in the Netherlands, and of the changes which the concentration of sovereign power in the hands of a single ruler brought into the relations of the various provinces with one another, and into their internal administration. The Netherlands became now, for the first time, something more than a geographical expression for a number of pretty feudal states, practically independent and almost always at strife. Henceforward there was peace, and throughout the whole of this northern part of his domains it was the constant policy of Philip gradually to abolish provincialism and to establish a centralized government. He was far too wise a statesman to attempt to abolish suddenly or arbitrarily the various rights and privileges which the Flemings, Brabanters and Hollanders had wrung from their sovereigns, and to which they were deeply attached; but, while respecting these, he endeavoured to restrict them as far as possible to local usage, and to centralize the general administration of the whole of the Pays de Pardessa, as the Burgundian dukes were accustomed to name their Netherland dominions, by the summoning of the representatives of the provincial states to an assembly styled the States General, and by the creation of a common court of appeal. The first time the States General were called together by Philip was in 1465, for the purpose of obtaining a loan for the war with France and the recognition of his son Charles as his successor, and from this time forward, at irregular intervals, but with increasing frequency, the practice of summoning this body went on. The States General, in a sense, represented the Netherlands as a whole, and it was a matter of great convenience for the sovereign, especially when large levies of money had to be raised, to be enabled thus to bring his proposals before a single assembly, instead of before a number of separate and independent provincial states. Nevertheless, it must be borne in mind that the States General had, as such, no authority to act on behalf of these several provincial states. Each of these sent their deputies to the General Assembly, but these deputies had to refer all matters to their principals before they could give their assent, and each body of deputies gave this assent separately, and without regard to the others. It was thus but a first provisional step towards unity of administration, but it did tend to promote a feeling of community of interest between the provinces, and to lead to the deputies having intercourse with one another and interchanging their views upon the various important subjects that were brought before their consideration. The period of disturbance and the weakening of the authority of the sovereign which followed the death of Charles the Bold led to the States General obtaining a position of increased importance, and they may from that time be regarded as forming a regular and necessary part of the machinery of government in the Burgundian Netherlands. The States General, however, like the provincial states, could only meet when summoned by the sovereign or his stadholder, and the causes for which they were summoned were such special occasions as the accession of a new sovereign, or the appointment of a new stadholder, or, more usually, for sanctioning the requests for levies of money, which were required for the maintenance of splendid courts and the cost of frequent wars. For not only the Burgundian princes, properly so called, but even Charles V had mainly to depend upon the wealth of the Netherlands for their financial needs. And here a distinction must be drawn. For solemn occasions, such as the accession of a new sovereign, or the acceptance of a newly appointed governor, representatives of all the provinces, eventually 17, were summoned. But for ordinary meetings for the purpose of money levies only those of the so-called patrimonial or old Burgundian provinces came together. The demands for tribute on the provinces acquired later, such as Gelderland, Groningen, Friesland and Overijssel, were made to each of these provinces separately, and they jealously claimed their right to be thus separately dealt with. In the case of the other provinces, the States General, as has already been stated, could only grant the money after obtaining from each province represented severally its assent, and this was often not gained until after considerable delay and much bargaining. Once granted, however, the assessment regulating the quota which the different provinces had to contribute was determined on the basis of the so-called quotestatie or setting, drawn up in 1462 on the occasion of a tribute for 10 years which Charles the Bold, as his father's stadholder in the Pays de Pardesa, then demanded. The relative wealth of the provinces may be judged from the fact that at this date Flanders and Brabant each paid a quarter of the whole levy, Holland 1/6, Zeeland 1/4 of Holland's share. As regards the provincial government, the Burgundian princes left undisturbed the local and historical customs and usages, and each province had its individual characteristics. At the head of each provincial government, with the exception of Brabant, at whose capital, Brussels, the sovereign himself or his regent resided, was placed a governor, with the title of stadholder, who was the representative of that sovereign and had large patronage. It was his duty to enforce edicts, preserve order, and keep a watchful eye over the administration of justice. He nominated to many municipal offices, but had little or no control over finance. The raising of troops and their command in the field was entrusted to a captain general, who might not be the same person as the stadholder, though the offices were sometimes united. In the northern Netherlands there was but one stadholder for the 3 provinces of Holland, Zeeland and Utrecht, and one, at a somewhat later date, for Friesland, Groningen, Drente and Overijssel. The desire of the Burgundian princes to consolidate their dominions into a unified sovereignty found itself thwarted by many obstacles, and especially by the lack of any supreme tribunal of appeal. It was galling to them that the Parlement of Paris should still exercise appellate jurisdiction in Crown Flanders and Artois, and the Imperial Diet in some of the other provinces. Already in 1428 Philip had erected the Court of Holland at the Hague, to exercise large powers of jurisdiction and financial control in the provinces of Holland and Zeeland, and in 1473 Charles the Bold set up at Mechelen the body known as the Great Council, to act as a court of appeal from the provincial courts. It was to be in the Netherlands what the Parlement of Paris was in France. The Great Council, which had grown out of the Privy Council attached to the person of the prince, and which under the direction of the Chancellor of Burgundy administrated the affairs of the government, more particularly justice and finance, was in 1473, as stated above, reconstituted as a court of appeal in legal matters, a new chamber of accounts being at the same time created to deal with finance. These efforts at centralisation of authority were undoubtedly for the good of the country as a whole, but such was the intensity of provincial jealousy and particularism that they were bitterly resented and opposed. In order to strengthen the sovereign's influence in the towns and to lessen the power of the guilds, Philip established in Holland, and so far as he could elsewhere, what were called vast colleges, or fixed committees of notables, to which were entrusted the election of the town officials and the municipal administration. These bodies were composed of a number of the richest and most influential burghers, who were styled the 24, the 40, the 60, or the 80, according to the number fixed for any particular town. These men were appointed for life, and their successors were chosen by co-option, so that the town corporations gradually became closed hereditary aristocracies, and the mass of the citizens were deprived of all voice in their own affairs. The schout, or chief judge, was chosen directly by the sovereign, or his stadholder, who also nominated the schepens, or sheriffs, from a list containing a double number, which was submitted to him. The reign of Philip the Good was marked by a great advance in the material prosperity of the land. Brugge, Ghent, Ypres, and Antwerp were among the most flourishing commercial and industrial cities in the world, and when, through the silting up of the waterway, Brugge ceased to be a seaport, Antwerp rapidly rose to a preeminence in her place, so that a few decades later her wharfs were crowded with shipping, and her warehouse with goods from every part of Europe. In fact, during the whole of the Burgundian period the southern Netherlands were the richest domain in Christendom, and continued to be so until the disastrous times of Philip II of Spain. Meanwhile Holland and Zeeland, though unable to compete with Brabant and Flanders in the populousness of their towns and the extent of their trade, were provinces of growing importance. Their strength lay in their sturdy and enterprising seafaring population. The Hollanders had for many years been the rivals of the Hanse towns for the Baltic trade. War broke out in 1438 and hostilities continued for 3 years, with the result that the Hanse League was beaten, and henceforth the Hollanders were able without further let or hindrance more and more to become the chief carriers of the Eastland traffic. Amsterdam was already a flourishing port, though as yet it could make no pretension of competing with Antwerp. The herring fisheries were, however, the staple industry of Holland and Zeeland. The discovery of the art of curing herrings by William Boekles of Beervliet (died 1447) had converted a perishable article of food into a marketable commodity, and not only did the fisheries give lucrative employment to many thousands of the inhabitants of these maritime provinces, but they also became the foundation on which was to be built their future commercial supremacy. The Burgundian dukes were among the most powerful rulers of their time, the equals of kings in all but name, and they far surpassed all contemporary sovereigns in their lavish display and the splendour of their court. The festival at Brugge in 1430, in celebration of the marriage of Philip the Good and Isabel of Portugal, at which the Order of the Golden Fleece was instituted, excited universal wonder, while his successor, Charles the Bold, contrived to surpass even his father in the splendour of his espousals with Margaret of York in 1468, and at his conference with the Emperor Frederick III at Trier in 1473. On this last occasion he wore a mantle encrusted all over with diamonds. The foundation of the Order of the Golden Fleece in 1430 was an event of great importance, as marking a step forward on the part of Philip in its assumption of quasi-regal attributes. The title was very appropriate, for it pointed to the wool and cloth trade as being the source of the wealth of Flanders. The order comprised 31 knights, chosen from the flower of the Burgundian nobles and the chief councillors of the sovereign. The statutes of the order set forth in detail the privileges of the members and their duties and obligations to their prince. They had a prescriptive claim to be consulted on all matters of importance, to be selected for the chief government posts, and to serve on military councils. The knights were exempt from the jurisdiction of all courts save that of their own chapter. Philip died in 1467 and was succeeded by his son Charles, who had already exercised for some years authority in the Netherlands as his father's deputy. Charles, as his surname, Le Tremier, witnesses, was a man of impulsive and autocratic temperament, but at the same time a hard worker, a great organizer, and a brilliant soldier, consumed with ambition to realize that restoration of a great Middle Lotharingian kingdom stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, for which his father had been working during his long and successful reign. He threw himself with almost passionate energy into the accomplishment of his task. With this object he was the first sovereign to depart from feudal usages and to maintain a standing army. He appeared at one time to be on the point of accomplishing his aim. Lorraine, which divided his southern from his northern possessions, was for a short time in his possession. Intervening in Gelderland between the Duke Arnold of Egmont and his son Adolf, he took the latter prisoner and obtained the duchy in pledge from the former. Uprisings in the Flemish towns against heavy taxation and arbitrary rule were put down with a strong hand. In September 1474 the Duke, accompanied by a splendid suite, met the Emperor Frederick III at Trier to receive the coveted crown from the imperial hands. It was arranged that Charles's only daughter and heiress should be betrothed to Maximilian of Austria, the Emperor's eldest son, and the very day and hour for the coronation were fixed. But the Burgundian had an enemy in Louis XI of France, who was as prudent and far-seeing as his rival was rash and impetuous, and who was far more than his match in political craft and cunning. French secret agents stirring up Frederick's suspicions against Charles's designs, and the Emperor suddenly left Trier, where he had felt humiliated by the splendour of his powerful vassal. The Duke was furious at his disappointment, but was only the more obstinately bent on carrying out his plans. But Louis had been meanwhile forming a strong League of Constance, March 1474, of various states threatened by Charles's ambitious projects. Duke Sigismund of Austria, Baden, Basel, Elsass, and the Swiss cantons united under the leadership of France to resist them. Charles led an army of 60,000 men to aid the Archbishop of Cologne against his subjects, but spent 11 months in a fruitless attempt to take a small fortified town, Neuss, in which a considerable portion of his army perished. He was compelled to raise large sums of money from his unwilling subjects in the Netherlands to repair his losses, and in 1475 he attacked Duke René of Lorraine, captured Nancy, and conquered the duchy, which had hitherto separated his Netherland from his French possessions. It was the first step in the accomplishment of his scheme for the restoration of the Lotharingian kingdom. In Elsass, however, the populace had risen in insurrection against the tyranny of the Burgundian governor, Peter van Hagenbach, and had tried and executed him. Finding that the Swiss aided the rebels, Charles now, without waiting to consolidate his conquest of Lorraine, determined to lead his army into Switzerland. At the head of a splendidly equipped force he encountered the Confederates near Granson, March 2, 1476, and was utterly routed, his own seal and order of the Golden Fleece, with vast booty, falling into the hands of the victors. A few months later, having recruited and reorganized his beaten army, he again led them against the Swiss. The encounter took place, June 21, 1476, at Morat, and once more the chivalry of Burgundy suffered complete defeat. Charles fled from the field, half insane with rage and disappointment, when the news that Duke René had reconquered Lorraine roused him from his torpor. He hastily gathered together a fresh army and laid siege to Nancy, but in siege operations he had no skill, and in the depth of winter, January 5, 1477, he was attacked by the Swiss and Lorrainers outside the walls of the town. A panic seized the Burgundians. Charles in person in vain strove to stem their flight, and he perished by an unknown hand. His body was found later, stripped naked, lying frozen in a pool. Charles left an only child, Mary, not yet 20 years of age. Mary found herself in a most difficult and trying situation. Louis XI, the hereditary enemy of her house, at once took possession of the Duchy of Burgundy, which, by failures of heirs male, had reverted to its liege lord. The sovereignty of the country of Burgundy, Franche Comté, being an imperial fief descending in the female line. She retained, but before her authority had been established, Louise had succeeded in persuading the states of the county to place themselves under a French protectorate. French armies overran Artois, Hainault, and Picardy, and were threatening Flanders, where there was in every city a party of French sympathizers. Gelderland welcomed the exiled Duke, Adolph, as their sovereign. Everywhere throughout the province the despotic rule of Duke Charles and his heavy exactions had aroused seething discontent. Mary was virtually a prisoner in the hands of her Flemish subjects, and before they consented to support her cause there was a universal demand for a redress of grievances. But Mary showed herself possessed of courage and statesmanship beyond her years, and she had this critical moment in her stepmother, Margaret of York, an experienced and capable adviser at her side. A meeting of the States General was at once summoned to Ghent. It met on February 3, 1477, Mary's 20th birthday. Representatives came from Flanders, Brabant, Artois and Namur in the southern, and from Holland and Zeeland in the northern Netherlands. Mary saw there was no course open to her but to accede to their demands. Only 8 days after the assembly met, the Charter of the Netherlands Liberties, called the Great Privilege, was agreed to and signed. By this act all previous ordinances conflicting with ancient privileges were abolished. The newly established Court of Appeal at Mechlin was replaced by a great council of 24 members chosen by the sovereign from the various states, which should advise and assist in the administration of government. Mary undertook not to marry or declare war without the assent of the States General. The States General and the provincial states were to meet as often as they wished, without the summons of the sovereign. All officials were to be native born. No Netherlander was to be tried by foreign judges. There were to be no forced loans, no alterations in the coinage. All edicts or ordinances infringing provincial rights were to be ipso facto null and void. By placing her seal to this document, Mary virtually abdicated the absolute sovereign power which had been exercised by her predecessors, and undid at a stroke the results of their really statesmanlike efforts to create out of a number of semi-autonomous provinces a unified state. Many of their acts and methods had been harsh and autocratic, especially those of Charles the Bold, but who can doubt that on the whole their policy was wise and salutary? In Holland and Zeeland a council was erected, consisting of a stadholder and 8 councillors, 6 Hollanders and 2 Zeelanders, of whom 2 were to be nobles, the others jurists. Wolfred van Borselen, Lord of Veere, was appointed stadholder. The great privilege granted, the states willingly raised a force of 34,000 men to resist the French invasion and adequate means for carrying on the war. But the troubles of the youthful Mary were not yet over. The hand of the heiress of so many rich domains was eagerly sought for: 1. by Louis of France for the Dauphin, a youth of 17 years; 2. by Maximilian of Austria, to whom she had been promised in marriage; 3. by Adolph, Duke of Gelderland, who was favoured by the States General. Adolph, however, was killed in battle. In Flanders there was a party who favoured the French and actually engaged in intrigues with Louis, but the mass of the people were intensely averse to French domination. To such an extent was this the case that 2 influential officials, the Lord Huguenot and Humbercourt, on whom suspicion fell of treacherous correspondence with the French king, were seized, tried by a special tribunal, and, despite the tears and entreaties of the Duchess, were condemned and beheaded in the marketplace of Ghent. Maximilian became therefore the accepted suitor, and on August 19, 1477, his marriage with Mary took place at the Brugs. This marriage was to have momentous consequences, not only for the Netherlands but for Europe. The union was a happy one, but unfortunately of brief duration. On March 29, 1482, Mary died from the effects of a fall from her horse, leaving 2 children, Philip and Margaret. End of chapter 1.
Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marion Brown, Toronto, Canada. History of Holland by George Edmundson. Chapter 2. Habsburg Rule in the Netherlands. Maximilian, on the death of Mary, found himself in a very difficult position. The Archduke was a man of high-soaring ideas, chivalrous, brave even to the point of audacity, full of expedients and never daunted by failure, but he was deficient in stability of character, and always hampered throughout his life by lack of funds. He had, in 1477, set himself to the task of defending Flanders and the southern provinces of the Netherlands against French attack, and not without considerable success. In 1482, as guardian of his 4-year-old son Philip, the heir to the domains of the House of Burgundy, he became regent of the Netherlands. His authority, however, was little recognized. Gelderland and Utrecht fell away altogether. Liege acknowledged William de la Marck as its ruler. Holland and Zeeland were torn by contending factions. Flanders, the centre of the Burgundian power, was specially hostile to its new governor. The burghers of Ghent refused to surrender to him his children, Philip and Margaret, who were held as hostages to secure themselves against any attempted infringement of their liberties. The Flemings even entered into negotiations with Louis XI, and the Archduke found himself compelled to sign a treaty with France, December 23, 1482. One of the conditions being the betrothal of his infant daughter to the Dauphin. Maximilian, however, found that for a time he must leave Flanders to put down the rising of the Hook faction in Holland, who, led by Frans van Brederode and in alliance with the anti-Burgundian party in Utrecht, had made themselves masters of Leyden. Beaten in a bloody fight by the regent, Brederode nevertheless managed to seize Sluis and Rotterdam, and from these ports he and his daring companions in arms, Jean van Nalduik, carried on a guerrilla warfare for some years. Brederode was killed in a fight at Brouwershaven, 1490, but Sluis still held out and was not taken till 2 years later. Meanwhile, Maximilian had to undertake a campaign against the Flemings, who were again in arms at the instigation of the turbulent burghers of Ghent and Bruges. Entering the province at the head of a large force, he compelled the rebel towns to submit and obtained possession of the person of his son Philip, July 1485. Elected in the following year King of the Romans, Maximilian left the Netherlands to be crowned at Aachen, April 1486. A war with France called him back, in the course of which he suffered a severe defeat at Bethune. At the beginning of 1488, Ghent and Bruges once more rebelled, and the Roman king, enticed to enter Bruges, was there seized and compelled to see his friends executed in the market-place beneath his prison window. For 7 months he was held a prisoner, nor was he released until he had sworn to surrender his powers as regent to the Council of Flemings, and to withdraw all his foreign troops from the Netherlands. He was forced to give hostages as a pledge of his good faith, among them his general, Philip of Cleef, who presently joined his captors. Maximilian, on arriving at the camp of the Emperor Frederick III, who had gathered together an army to release his imprisoned son, was persuaded to break an oath given under duress. He advanced, therefore, at the head of his German mercenaries into Flanders, but was able to achieve little success against the Flemings, who found in Philip of Cleef an able commander. Despairing of success, he now determined to retire into Germany, leaving Duke Albert of Saxe-Meissen, a capable and tried soldier of fortune, as general-in-chief of his forces, and stadholder of the Netherlands. With the coming of Duke Albert, order was at length to be restored, though not without a severe struggle. Slowly but surely Duke Albert took town after town and reduced province after province into submission. The Hook party in Holland and Zeeland, and their anti-Burgundian allies in Utrecht, and Robert de la Marck in Liege, in turn felt the force of his arm. An insurrection of the peasants in West Friesland and Kennemerland, the bread and cheese folk as they were called, was easily put down. Philip of Cleef, with his Flemings, was unable to make head against him, and with the fall of Ghent and Sluis in the summer of 1492, the Duke was able to announce to Maximilian that the Netherlands, except Gelderland, were pacified. The Treaty of Senlis in 1493 ended the war with France. In the following year, after his accession to the imperial throne, Maximilian retired to his ancestral dominions in Germany, and his son, Philip the Fair, took in his hands the reins of government. The young sovereign, who was a Netherlander by birth and had spent all his life in the country, was more popular than his father, and his succession to the larger part of the Burgundian inheritance was not disputed. He received the homage of Zeeland at Roemerswaal, of Holland at Geertruidenberg, and seized the occasion to announce the abrogation of the great privilege, and at the same time restored the Grand Council of Mechlin. In Utrecht the authority of Bishop David of Burgundy was now firmly re-established, and on his death Philip of Baden, an obsequious adherent of the House of Austria, was elected. These results of the pacification carried out so successfully by Duke Albert had, however, left Maximilian and Philip deeply in debt to the Saxon, and there was no money wherewith to meet the claim, which amounted to 300,000 guilders. After many negotiations extending over several years, compensation was found for Albert in Friesland. That unhappy province and the adjoining territory of Groningen had for a long time been torn by internal dissensions between the two parties, the Scheeringers and the Vetkoopers, who were the counterparts of the Hooks and Cods of Holland. The Scheeringers called in the aid of the Saxon duke, who brought the land into subjection. Maximilian now recognized Albert as hereditary podesta or governor of Friesland, on condition that the House of Austria reserved the right of redeeming the territory for 100,000 guilders, and Philip acquiesced in the bargain, by which Frisian freedom was sold in exchange for the cancelling of a debt. The struggle with Charles of Egmont in Gelderland was not so easily terminated. Not till 1505 was Philip able to overcome this crafty and skilful adversary. Charles was compelled to do homage and to accompany Philip to Brussels, October 1505. It was, however, but a brief submission. Charles made his escape once more into Gelderland and renewed the War of Independence. Before these events had taken place, the marriage of Philip with Juana, the daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabel of Castile, had brought about a complete change in his fortunes. Maximilian, always full of ambitious projects for the aggrandizement of his house, had planned with Ferdinand of Aragon a double marriage between their families, prompted by a common hatred and fear of the growing power of France. The Archduke Philip was to wed the Infanta Juana, the second daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel. The infant Juan, the heir of the thrones of Aragon and Castile, Philip's sister, Margaret. Margaret had, in 1483, aged then 3 years, been betrothed to the Dauphin Charles, aged 12, and she was brought up at the French court after the death of Louis XI, August 30th, 1483. Had borne the title of queen and had lived at Amboise with other children of the French royal house under the care of the regent, Anne de Beaujeu. The marriage, however, of Charles VIII and Margaret was never to be consummated. In August 1488 the male line of the Dukes of Brittany became extinct, and the hand of the heiress, Anne of Brittany, a girl of 12, attracted many suitors. It was clearly a matter of supreme importance to the King of France that this important territory should not pass by marriage into the hands of an enemy. The Bretons, on the other hand, clung to their independence and dreaded absorption in the unifying French state. After many intrigues, her council advised the young duchess to accept Maximilian as her husband, and she was married to him by proxy in March 1490. Charles VIII immediately entered Brittany at the head of a strong force, and despite a fierce and prolonged resistance conquered the country, and gained possession of Anne's person, August 1491. The temptation was too strong to be resisted. Margaret, after residing in France as his affianced wife for 8 years, was repudiated and finally 2 years later sent back to the Netherlands, while Anne was compelled to break off her marriage with Margaret's father and became Charles's queen. This double slight was never forgotten either by Maximilian or by Margaret, and was the direct cause of the negotiations for the double Spanish marriage, which, though delayed by the suspicious caution of the two chief negotiators, Ferdinand and Maximilian, was at length arranged. In August 1496 an imposing fleet conveyed the Infanta Juana to Antwerp, and she was married to Philip at Lille. In the following April Margaret and Don Juan were wedded in the Cathedral of Burgos. The union was followed by a series of catastrophes in the Spanish royal family. While on his way with his wife to attend the marriage of his older sister Isabel with the King of Portugal, Juan caught a malignant fever and expired at Salamanca in October 1497. The newly married Queen of Portugal now became the heiress to the crowns of Aragon and Castile, but she died a year later, and shortly afterwards her infant son. The succession therefore passed to the younger sister Juana, and Philip the Fair, the heir of the House of Austria, and already through his mother the ruler of the rich Burgundian domain, became through his wife the prospective sovereign of the Spanish kingdoms of Ferdinand and Isabel. Fortune seemed to have reserved all her smiles for the young prince, when on February 24th, 1500, a son was born to him at Ghent, who received the name Charles. But dark days were soon to follow. Philip was pleasure-loving and dissolute, and he showed little affection for his wife, who had already begun to exhibit symptoms of that weakness of mind which was before long to develop into insanity. However, in 1501 they journeyed together to Spain, in order to secure Juana's rights to the Castilian succession, and also to that of Aragon, should King Ferdinand die without an heir male. In November 1504 Isabel the Catholic had died, and Philip and his consort at once assumed the titles of King and Queen of Castile, in spite of the opposition of Ferdinand, who claimed the right of regency during his lifetime. Both parties were anxious to obtain the support of Henry VII. Already since the accession of Philip, the commercial relations between England and the Netherlands had been placed on what proved to be a permanently friendly basis by the treaty known as the Magnus Intercursus of 1496. Flanders and Brabant were dependent upon the supply of English wool for their staple industries, Holland and Zeeland for that freedom of fishery on which a large part of their population was employed and subsisted. In reprisals for the support formerly given by the Burgundian government to the House of York, Henry had forbidden the exportation of wool and of cloth to the Netherlands, had removed the staple from Bruges to Calais, and had withdrawn the fishing rights enjoyed by the Hollanders since the reign of Edward I. But this state of commercial war was ruinous to both countries, and on condition that Philip henceforth undertook not to allow any enemies of the English government to reside in his dominions, a good understanding was reached, and the Magnus Intercursus, which re-established something like freedom of trade between the countries, was duly signed in February 1496. The treaty was solemnly renewed in 1501, but shortly afterwards fresh difficulties arose concerning Yorkist refugees, and a stoppage of trade was once more threatened. At this juncture a storm drove Philip and Juana, who had set sail in January 1506 for Spain, to take refuge in an English harbour. For 3 months they were hospitably entertained by Henry, but he did not fail to take advantage of the situation to negotiate 3 treaties with his unwilling guest: 1. A treaty of alliance; 2. A treaty of marriage with Philip's sister, the Archduchess Margaret, already at the age of 25 a widow for the second time; 3. A revision of the Treaty of Commerce of 1496, named from its unfavourable conditions Malus Intercursus. The marriage treaty came to nothing, through the absolute refusal of Margaret to accept the hand of the English king. Philip and Juana left England for Spain April 23rd to assume the government of the three kingdoms, Castile, Leon, and Granada, which Juana had inherited from her mother. Owing to his wife's mental incapacity, Philip in her name exercised all the powers of sovereignty, but his reign was very short, for he was suddenly taken ill and died at Burgos, September 25th, 1506. His hapless wife, after the birth of a posthumous child, sank into a state of hopeless insanity, and passed the rest of her long life in confinement. Charles, the heir to so vast an inheritance, was but 6 years old. The representatives of the provinces assembled at Mechlin, October 18th, offered the regency of the Burgundian dominions to the Emperor Maximilian. He, in his turn, nominated his daughter Margaret to be regent in his place, and guardian of his grandson during Charles' minority, and she with the assent of the States General took the oath on her installation as Mambour or Governor-General of the Netherlands, March 1507. Margaret was but 27 years of age, and for 24 years she continued to administer the affairs of the Netherlands with singular discretion, firmness, and statesmanlike ability. The superintendence and training of the young Archduke could have been placed in no better hands. Charles, who with his 3 sisters lived with his aunt in Mechlin, was thus, both by birth and education, a Netherlander. One of the first acts of Margaret was a refusal to ratify the Malus Intercursus and the revival of the Magnus Intercursus of 1496. This important commercial treaty from that time forward continued in force for more than a century. The great difficulty that Margaret encountered in her government was the lack of adequate financial resources. The extensive privileges accorded to the various provinces and their mutual jealousies and diverse interests made the task of levying taxes arduous and often fruitless. Margaret found that the granting of supplies, even for so necessary a purpose as the raising of troops to resist the raids of Charles of Gelderland, aided by the French king, into Utrecht and Holland, was refused. She fortunately possessed in a high degree those qualities of persuasive address and sound judgment, which gave to her a foremost place among the diplomatists and rulers of her time. Such was the confidence that her brilliant abilities inspired that she was deputed both by the Emperor Maximilian and by Ferdinand of Aragon to be their plenipotentiary at the peace conference that assembled at Cambrai in November 1508. Chiefly through her exertions the negotiations had a speedy and successful issue, and the famous treaty known as the League of Cambrai was signed on December 10th. By this treaty many of the disputes concerning the rights and prerogatives of the French crown in the Burgundian Netherlands were amicably settled, and it was arranged that Charles of Egmont should be provisionally recognized as Duke of Gelderland on condition that he should give up the towns in Holland that he had captured and withdraw his troops within his own borders. The extant correspondence between Maximilian and Margaret, which is of the most confidential character on matters of high policy, is a proof of the high opinion the Emperor entertained of his daughter's intelligence and capacity. In nothing was his confidence more justified than in the assiduous care and interest that the regent took in the education of the Archduke Charles and his 3 sisters, who had been placed in her charge. In 1515 Charles, on entering his 16th year, was declared by Maximilian to be of age. Margaret accordingly handed over to him the reins of government, and withdrew for the time into private life. Her retirement was not, however, to be of long continuance. On January 23rd, 1516, King Ferdinand of Aragon died, and Charles, who now became King of Castile and of Aragon, was obliged to leave the Netherlands to take possession of his Spanish dominions. Before sailing he reinstated his aunt as governess and appointed a council to assist her. This post she continued to hold till the day of her death, for Charles was never again able to take up his permanent residence in the Netherlands. During the first years of his accession to the thrones of Ferdinand and Isabel he was much occupied with Spanish affairs, and the death of Maximilian, January 12, 1519, opened out to him a still wider field of ambition and activity. On June 28th Charles was elected emperor, a result which he owed in no small degree to the diplomatic skill and activity of Margaret. Just a year later the emperor visited the Netherlands, where Charles of Gelderland was again giving trouble, and his presence was required both for the purpose of dealing with the affairs of the provinces and also for securing a grant of supply, for which he was sorely in need of funds. Margaret had, at his request, summoned the States General to meet at Brussels, where Charles personally addressed them, and explained at some length the reasons which led him to ask his loyal and devoted Netherlands subjects for their aid on his election to the imperial dignity. The States General on this, as on other occasions, showed no niggardliness in responding to the request of a sovereign who, though almost always absent, appealed to their patriotism as a born Netherlander, who had been brought up in their midst and spoke their tongue. Charles was crowned at Aachen, October 23, 1520, and some 3 months later presided at the famous Diet of Worms, where he met Martin Luther face to face. Before starting on his momentous journey he again appointed Margaret regent and gave to her council, which he nominated, large powers. The Council of Mechlin, the Court of Holland, and other provisional tribunals being subjected to its superior authority and jurisdiction. By this action the privileges of the provinces were infringed, but Charles was resolute in carrying out the centralizing policy of his ancestors, the Dukes of Burgundy, and he had the power to enforce his will in spite of the protests that were raised. And so, under the wise and conciliatory but firm administration of Margaret, during a decade of almost continuous religious and international strife, a decade marked by such great events as the rapid growth of the Reformation in Germany, the defeat and capture of Francis I at Pavia, the sack of Rome by the troops of Bourbon, and the victorious advance of the Turks in Hungary and along the eastern frontier of the empire, the Netherland provinces remained at peace, save for the restless intrigues of Charles of Egmont in Gelderland, and prospered. Their wealth furnished indeed no small portion of the funds which enabled Charles to face successfully so many adversaries, and to humble the power of France. The last important act of Margaret, like her first, was connected with the town of Cambrai. In this town, as the representative and plenipotentiary of her nephew the emperor, she met, July 1529, Louise of Savoy, who had been granted similar powers by her son Francis I to negotiate a treaty of peace. The two princesses proved worthy of the trust that had been placed in them, and a general treaty of peace, often spoken of as the Ladies' Peace, was speedily drawn up and ratified. The conditions were highly advantageous to the interests of Spain and the Netherlands. On November 30th of the following year Margaret died, as the result of a slight accident to her foot, which the medical science of the day did not know how to treat properly, in the 50th year of her age and the 24th of her regency. Charles, who had a few months previously reached the zenith of his power by being crowned with the Iron Crown of Lombardy and with the imperial crown at the hands of Pope Clement VII at Bologna, February 22nd and 24th, 1530, appointed as governess in Margaret's place his sister Mary, the widowed queen of Louis, King of Hungary, who had been slain by the Turks at the Battle of Mohacs, August 29th, 1526. Mary, who had passed her early life in the Netherlands under the care of her Aunt Margaret, proved herself in every way her worthy successor. She possessed, like Margaret, a strong character, statesmanlike qualities, and singular capacity in the administration of affairs. She filled the difficult post of regent for the whole period of 24 years between the death of Margaret and the abdication of Charles V in 1555. It was fortunate indeed for that great sovereign that these two eminent women of his house should, each in turn for one half of his long reign, have so admirably conducted the government of this important portion of his dominions, as to leave him free for the carrying out of his far-reaching political projects and constant military campaigns in other lands. 2 years after Mary entered upon her regency, Charles appointed 3 advisory and administrative bodies, the Council of State, the Council of Finance, and the Privy Council, to assist her in the government. The Council of State dealt with questions of external and internal policy and with the appointment of officials, the Council of Finance with the care of the revenue and private domains of the sovereign. To the Privy Council were entrusted the publications of edicts and placards and the care of justice and police. When Charles succeeded Philip the Fair, only a portion of the Netherlands was subject to his sway. With steady persistence he set himself to the task of bringing all the 17 provinces under one sovereign. In 1515 George of Saxe-Meissen sold to him his rights over Friesland. Henry of Bavaria, who in opposition to his wishes had been elected Bishop of Utrecht, was compelled, 1528, to cede to him the temporalities of the see, retaining the spiritual office only. Charles thus added the Upper and Lower Strict, Utrecht and Overyssel to his domains. He made himself, 1536, master of Groningen and Drenthe after a long and obstinate struggle with Charles of Gelderland, and 7 years later he forced Charles' successor, William of Jülich and Cleves, to renounce in his favour his claims to Gelderland and Zutphen. During the reign of Charles V the States General were summoned many times, chiefly for the purpose of voting subsidies, but it was only on special and solemn occasions that the representatives of all the 17 provinces were present, as for instance when Philip received their homage in 1549 and when Charles V announced his abdication in 1555. The names of the 17 provinces summoned on these occasions were Brabant, Limburg, Luxembourg, Gelderland, Flanders, Holland, Zeeland, Artois, Hainault, Namur, Lille with Douay and Orchies, Tournai and District Mechlin, Friesland, Utrecht, Overyssel with Drenthe and Groningen. The bishopric of Liege, though nominally independent, was under the strict control of the government at Brussels. The relations of Charles's Burgundian domains to the empire were a matter of no small moment, and he was able to regulate them in a manner satisfactory to himself. Several times during his reign tentative attempts were made to define those relations, which were of a very loose kind. The fact that the head of the house of Habsburg was himself emperor had not made him any less determined than the Burgundian sovereigns, his ancestors, to assert for his Netherland territories a virtual independence of imperial control or obligation. The various states of which the Netherlands were composed were as much opposed as the central government at Brussels to any recognition of the claims of the empire, and both Margaret of Austria and Mary of Hungary ventured to refuse to send representatives to the imperial diets, even when requested to do so by the emperor. At last, in 1548, when all the Netherland provinces had been brought under the direct dominion or control of one sovereign prince, a convention was drawn up at the Diet of Augsburg, chiefly by the exertions of the Regent Mary and her tried councillors Viglius and Grenville, by which the unity of the Netherland territories was recognized and they were freed from imperial jurisdiction. Nominally they formed a circle of the empire, the Burgundian Circle, and representatives of the circle were supposed to appear at the diets and to bear a certain share of imperial taxation in return for the right to the protection of the empire against attacks by France. As a matter of fact, no representatives were ever sent, and no subsidy was paid, nor was the protection of the empire ever sought or given. This convention, which in reality severed the shadowy links which had hitherto bound the Netherlands to the empire, received the sanction of the States General in October 1548, and it was followed by the issuing, with the consent of the Estates of the various provinces, of a pragmatic sanction by which the inherited right of succession to the sovereignty in each and every province was settled upon the male and female line of Charles's descendants, notwithstanding the existence of ancient provincial privileges to the contrary. In 1549 the emperor's only son Philip was acknowledged by all the estates as their future sovereign, and made a journey through the land to receive homage. The doctrines of the Reformation had early obtained a footing in various parts of the Netherlands. At first it was the teaching of Luther and of Zwingli which gained adherents. Somewhat later the Anabaptist movement made great headway in Holland and Friesland, especially in Amsterdam. The chief leaders of the Anabaptists were natives of Holland, including the famous or infamous John of Leyden, who with some thousands of these fanatical sectaries perished at Munster in 1535. Between 1537 and 1543, a more moderate form of Anabaptist teaching made rapid progress through the preaching of a certain Menno Simonsoen. The followers of this man were called Mennonites. Meanwhile, Lutheranism and Zwinglianism were, in many parts of the country, being supplanted by the sterner doctrines of Calvin. All these movements were viewed by the emperor with growing anxiety and detestation. Whatever compromises with the Reformation he might be compelled to make in Germany, he was determined to extirpate heresy from his hereditary dominions. He issued a strong placard soon after the Diet of Worms in 1521, condemning Luther and his opinions, and forbidding the printing or sale of any of the Reformer's writings, and between that date and 1555 a dozen other edicts and placards were issued of increasing stringency. The most severe was the so-called Blood Placard of 1550. This enacted the sentence of death against all convicted of heresy, the man to be executed with the sword, and the women buried alive. In cases of obstinacy, both men and women were to be burnt. Terribly harsh as were these edicts, it is doubtful whether the number of those who suffered the extreme penalty had not been greatly exaggerated by partisan writers. Of the thousands who perished, by far the greater part were Anabaptists, and these met their fate rather as enemies of the state and of society than as heretics. They were political as well as religious anarchists. In the time of Charles, the trade and industries of the Netherlands were in a highly prosperous state. The Burgundian provinces, under the wise administration of Margaret and Mary, were protected by the strong arm of the emperor from foreign attack, were at this period by far the richest state in Europe, and the financial mainstay of the Habsburg power. Bruges, however, had now ceased to be the central market and exchange of Europe, owing to the silting up of the river Zwin. It was no longer a port, and its place had been taken by Antwerp. At the close of the reign of Charles, Antwerp, with its magnificent harbour on the Scheldt, had become the counting-house of the nations, the greatest port, and the wealthiest and most luxurious city in the world. Agents of the principal bankers and merchants of every country had their offices within its walls. It has been estimated that, inclusive of the many foreigners who made the town their temporary abode, the population of Antwerp in 1560 was about 150,000. 500 vessels sailed in and out of her harbour daily, and 5 times that number were to be seen thronging her wharves at the same time. To the north of the Scheldt the condition of things was not less satisfactory than in the south, particularly in Holland. The commercial prosperity of Holland was in most respects different in kind from that of Flanders and Brabant, and during the period with which we are dealing had been making rapid advances, but on independent lines. A manufactory of the coarser kinds of cloth, established at Leyden, had indeed for a time met with a considerable measure of success, but had fallen into decline in the time of Mary of Hungary. The nature of his country led the Hollander to be either a sailor or a dairy farmer, not an artisan or operative. Akin though he was in race to the Fleming and the Brabanter, his instincts led him by the force of circumstances to turn his energies in other directions. Subsequent history has but emphasized the fact, which from the 14th century onwards is clearly evident, that the people who inhabited the low-lying sea-girt lands of Dijk, Canal, and Polder in Holland and Zeeland were distinct in character and temper from the citizens of Bruges, Ghent, Ypres, Brussels, or Mechlin, who were essentially landsmen and artisans. Ever since the discovery of the art of curing herrings, ascribed to William Boekels, the herring fishery had acquired a great importance to the Hollanders and Zeelanders, and formed the chief livelihood of a large part of the entire population of those provinces, and many thousands, who did not themselves sail in the fishing fleets, found employment in the ship and boat-building wharves, and in the making of sails, cordage, nets, and other tackle. It was in this hazardous occupation that the hardy race of skilled and seasoned seamen, who were destined to play so decisive a part in the coming wars of independence, had their early training. The herring harvest, through the careful and scientific methods that were employed in curing the fish and packing them in barrels, became a durable and much sought-for article of commerce. A small portion of the catch, served as a supply of food for home consumption. The great bulk, in its thousands of barrels, was a marketable commodity, and the distribution of the cured herring to distant ports became a lucrative business. It had two important consequences: the formation of a Dutch mercantile marine, and the growth of Amsterdam, which from small beginnings had in the middle of the 16th century become a town with 40,000 inhabitants, and a port second only in importance in the Netherlands to Antwerp. From its harbour at the confluence of the estuary of the Y with the Zuider Zee, ships owned and manned by Hollanders sailed along the coast of France and Spain to bring home the salt for curing purposes, and with it wines and other southern products, while year by year a still larger and increasing number entered the Baltic. In those eastern waters they competed with the German Hanseatic cities, with whom they had many acrimonious disputes, and with such success that the Hollanders gradually monopolized the traffic in grain, hemp, and other Eastland commodities, and became practically the freight carriers of the Baltic. And be it remembered that they were able to achieve this because many of the North Netherland towns were themselves members of the Hanse League, and possessed therefore the same rights and privileges commercially as their rivals Hamburg, Lübeck, and Danzig. The great industrial cities of Flanders and Brabant, on the other hand, not being members of the League, nor having any mercantile marine of their own, were content to transact business with the foreign agents of the Hanse towns, who had their counting-houses at Antwerp. It will thus be seen that in the middle of the 16th century the trade of the northern provinces, though as yet not to be compared in volume to that of the Flemings and Walloons, had before it an opening field of enterprise and energy rich in possibilities and promise for the future. Such was the state of affairs, political, religious, and economical, when in the year 1555 the Emperor Charles V, prematurely aged by the heavy burden of 40 years of world-wide sovereignty, worn out by his constant campaigns and weary of the cares of state, announced his intention of abdicating and retiring into a monastery. On April 25, 1555, the act of abdication was solemnly and with impressive ceremonial carried out in the presence of the representatives of the 17 provinces of the Netherlands, specially summoned to meet their sovereign for the last time in the great hall of the palace at Brussels. Charles took an affecting farewell of his Netherland subjects, and concluded by asking them to exhibit the same regard and loyalty to his son Philip as they had always displayed to himself. Much feeling was shown, for Charles, despite the many and varied calls and duties which had prevented him from residing for any length of time in the Netherlands, had always been at pains to manifest a special interest in the country of his birth. The Netherlands were to him throughout life his homeland, and its people looked upon him as their fellow countrymen. And not even the constant demands that Charles had made for financial aid, nor the stern edicts against heresy, had estranged them from him. The abdication was the more regretted because at the same time Mary of Hungary laid down her office as regent, the arduous duties of which she had so long and so ably discharged. On the following day, October 26th, the Knights of the Golden Fleece, the members of the councils, and the deputies of the provinces took the oath of allegiance to Philip, the emperor's only son and heir, and Philip on his side solemnly undertook to maintain unimpaired the ancient rights and privileges of the several provinces. End of Chapter 2.
Is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Kirsten Ferreri. The History of Holland by George Edmundson. Chapter 3. The Prelude to the Revolt. Philip, at the time of his accession to the sovereignty of the Netherlands, was already King of Naples and Sicily, and Duke of Milan, and by his marriage in 1554 to Mary Tudor, King Consort of England, in which country he was residing when summoned by his father to assist at the abdication ceremony at Brussels. A few months later, January 16, 1556, by a further act of abdication on the part of Charles V, he became King of Castile and Aragon. It was a tremendous inheritance, and there is no reason to doubt that Philip entered upon his task with a deep sense that he had a mission to fulfil, and with a self-sacrificing determination to spare himself no personal labour in the discharge of his duties. But though he bore to his father a certain physical likeness, Philip in character and disposition was almost his antithesis. Silent, reserved, inaccessible, Philip had none of the restless energy or the geniality of Charles, and was as slow and undecided in action as he was bigoted in his opinions and unscrupulous in his determination to compass his ends. He found himself, on his accession to power, faced with many difficulties, for the treasury was not merely empty, it was burdened with debt. Through lack of means he was compelled to patch up a temporary peace (February 5, 1556) with the French king at Vaucelles, and to take steps to reorganise his finances. One of Philip's first acts was the appointment of Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy, to the post vacated by his Aunt Mary, but it was a position, as long as the king remained in the Netherlands, of small responsibility. Early in 1556 he summoned the States General to Brussels and asked for a grant of 1,300,000 florins. The taxes proposed were disapproved by the principal provinces and eventually refused. Philip was very much annoyed, but was compelled to modify his proposals and accept what was offered by the delegates. There was indeed from the very outset no love lost between the new ruler and his Netherland subjects. Philip had spent nearly all his life in Spain, where he had received his education and early training, and he had grown up to manhood in the narrowest sense of the word, a Spaniard. He was as unfamiliar with the laws, customs, and privileges of the several provinces of his Netherland dominions as he was with the language of their peoples. He spoke and wrote only Castilian correctly, and during his 4 years' residence at Brussels he remained coldly and haughtily aloof, a foreigner and alien in a land where he never felt at home. Philip at the beginning of his reign honestly endeavoured to follow in his father's steps and to carry out his policy, but acts which the great emperor with his conciliatory address and Flemish sympathies could venture upon with impunity became suspect and questionable when attempted by the son. Philip made the great mistake of taking into his private confidence only foreign advisers, chief among whom was Anthony Perrenot de Granville, Bishop of Arras, a Burgundian by birth, the son of Nicholas Perrenot, who for 30 years had been the trusted counsellor of Charles V. The opening of Philip's reign was marked by signal military successes. War broke out afresh with France, after a brief truce in 1557. The French arms, however, sustained 2 crushing reverses at St. Quentin, August 10, 1557, and at Gravelines, July 13, 1558. Lamoral, Count of Egmont, who commanded the cavalry, was the chief agent in winning these victories. By the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis peace was concluded, in which the French made many concessions, but were allowed to retain, at the cost of Philip's ally, the town of Calais, which had been captured from the English by a surprise attack in 1558. By the death of Queen Mary, which was said to have been hastened by the news of the loss of Calais, Philip's relations with England were entirely changed, and one of the reasons for a continuance of his residence in the Netherlands was removed. Peace with France, therefore, was no sooner assured than Philip determined to return to Spain, where his presence was required. He chose his half-sister Margaret, Duchess of Parma, to be regent in place of the Duke of Savoy. In July he summoned the chapter of the Order of the Golden Fleece, destined to be the last that was ever held, to Ghent in order to announce his intended departure. A little later the States General were called together, also at Ghent, for a solemn leave-taking. On August 26th Philip embarked at Flushing and quitted the Netherlands, never again to return. Philip's choice of Margaret as a governess-general was a happy one. She was the natural daughter of Charles V. Her mother was a Fleming, and she had been brought up under the care of her aunts, Margaret of Austria and Mary of Hungary. She resembled those able rulers in being a woman of strong character and statesmanlike qualities, and no doubt she would have been as successful in her administration had she had the same opportunities and the same freedom of action as her predecessors. Philip, however, though henceforth he passed the whole of his life in Spain, had no intention of loosening in any way his grasp of the reins of power, or of delegating any share of his sovereign authority. On his return to Madrid he showed plainly that he meant to treat the Netherland provinces as if they were dependencies of the Spanish crown, and he required from Margaret and her advisers that all the details of policy, legislation and administration should be submitted to him for supervision and sanction. This necessitated the writing of voluminous despatches, and entailed with a man of his habits of indecision interminable delays. Margaret, moreover, was instructed that in all matters she must be guided by the advice of her three councils. By far the most important of the three was the Council of State, which at this time consisted of 5 members: Anthony Granvelle, Bishop of Arras, Baron de Barlaymont, Viglius van Swychem van Aytta, Lamoral, Count of Egmont, and William, Prince of Orange. Barlaymont was likewise President of the Council of Finance, and Viglius President of the Privy Council. By far the most important member of the Council of State, as he was much the ablest, was the Bishop of Arras, and he, with Barlaymont and Viglius, formed an inner confidential council from whom alone the regent asked advice. The members of this inner council, nicknamed the Consulta, were all devoted to the interests of Philip. Egmont and Orange, because of their great influence and popularity with the people, were allowed to be nominally councillors of state, but they were rarely consulted and were practically shut out from confidential access to the regent. It is no wonder that both were discontented with their position, and soon showed openly their dissatisfaction. Egmont, a man of showy rather than solid qualities, held in 1559 the important posts of Stadholder of Flanders and Artois. The Prince of Orange was the eldest of the 5 sons of William, Count of Nassau-Dillenburg, head of the younger or German branch of the famous House of Nassau. Members of the elder or Netherland branch had for several generations rendered distinguished services to their Burgundian and Habsburg sovereigns. This elder branch became extinct in the person of René, the son of Henry of Nassau, one of Charles V's most trusted friends and advisers, by Claude, sister of Philibert, Prince of Orange-Chalon. Philibert, being childless, bequeathed his small principality to René, and René, in his turn, being killed at the siege of Saint-Dizier in 1554, left by will all his possessions to his cousin William, who thus became Prince of Orange. His parents were Lutherans, but Charles insisted that William, at the time 11 years of age, should be brought up as a Catholic in the court of Mary of Hungary. Here he became a great favourite of the emperor, who in 1550 conferred on him the hand of a great heiress, Anne of Egmont, only child of the Count of Buren. Anne died in 1558, leaving 2 children, a son, Philip William, and a daughter. At the ceremony of the abdication in 1555, Charles entered the hall leaning on the shoulder of William, on whom, despite his youth, he had already bestowed an important command. Philip likewise specially recognised William's ability, and gave evidence of his confidence in him by appointing him one of the plenipotentiaries to conclude with France the treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559. He had also made him a Knight of the Golden Fleece, a Councillor of State and Stadholder of Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht and Burgundy, Franche-Comté. Nevertheless there arose between Philip and Orange a growing feeling of distrust and dislike, with the result that William speedily found himself at the head of a patriotic opposition to any attempts of the Spanish king to govern the Netherlands by Spanish methods. The presence of a large body of Spanish troops in the country aroused the suspicion that Philip intended to use them, if necessary, to support him in overriding by force the liberties and privileges of the provinces. It was largely owing to the influence of Orange that the States General in 1559 refused to vote the grant of supplies for which Philip had asked, unless he promised that all foreign troops should be withdrawn from the Netherlands. The king was much incensed at such a humiliating rebuff, and is reported, when on the point of embarking at Flushing, to have charged William with being the man who had instigated the States thus to thwart him. Thus, when Margaret of Parma entered upon her duties as regent, she found that there was a feeling of deep dissatisfaction and general irritation in the provinces, and this was accentuated as soon as it was found that, though Philip had departed, his policy remained. The spirit of the absent king from his distant cabinet in Madrid brooded, as it were, over the state. It was soon seen that Margaret, whatever her statesmanlike qualities or natural inclination might be, had no real authority, nor was she permitted to take any steps or to initiate any policy without the advice and approval of the three confidential councillors placed at her side by Philip, Granvelle, Viglius and Barlaymont. Of these, Granvelle, both by reason of his conspicuous abilities and of his being admitted more freely than any one else into the inner councils of a sovereign, as secretive in his methods as he was suspicious and distrustful of his agents, held the foremost position, and drew upon himself the odium of a policy with which, though it was dictated from Spain, his name was identified. Orange and Egmont, with whom were joined a number of other leading nobles, among these Philip de Montmorency, Count of Hoorn, his brother the Lord of Montigny, the Counts of Meghem and Hoogstraeten, and the Marquis of Bergen, little by little adopted an attitude of increasing hostility to this policy, which they regarded as anti-national and tending to the establishment of a foreign despotism in the Netherlands. The continued presence of the Spanish troops, the severe measures that were being taken for the suppression of heresy, and a proposal for the erection of a number of new bishoprics, aroused popular discontent and suspicion. Orange and Egmont, finding that they were never consulted except on matters of routine, wrote to Philip, July 1561, stating that they found that their attendance at the meetings of the Council of State was useless, and asked to be allowed to resign their posts. Meanwhile, feeling that the presence of the Spanish troops was a source of weakness rather than of strength, Margaret and Granvelle were urging upon the king the necessity of their withdrawal. Neither the nobles nor the regents succeeded in obtaining any satisfactory response. Orange and Egmont accordingly absented themselves from the council, and Margaret ventured on her own authority to send away the Spanish regiments. The question of the bishoprics was more serious. It was not a new question. The episcopal organisation in the Netherlands was admittedly inadequate. It had long been the intention of Charles V to create a number of new sees, but in his crowded life he had never found the opportunity of carrying out the proposed scheme, and it was one of the legacies that at his abdication he handed on to his son. One of the first steps taken by Philip was to obtain a bull from Pope Paul IV for the creation of the new bishoprics, and this bull was renewed and confirmed by Pius IV, January 1560. Up to this time the entire area of the 17 provinces had been divided into 3 unwieldy dioceses, Utrecht, Arras and Tournai. The See of Utrecht comprised nearly the whole of the modern kingdom of the Netherlands, nor was there any archiepiscopal see. The metropolitical jurisdiction was exercised by the 3 foreign archbishops of Cologne, Reims and Treves. Philip now divided the land into 14 dioceses. Charles had proposed 6, with 3 metropolitans at Mechlin, Utrecht and 's-Hertogenbosch. Granvelle, who had obtained the cardinal's hat in February of 1561, was appointed Archbishop of Mechlin, and by virtue of this office Primate of the Netherlands, December 1561. This new organisation was not carried out without arousing widespread opposition. The existing bishops resented the diminution of their jurisdiction and dignity, and still louder were the protests of the abbots, whose endowments were appropriated to furnish the incomes of the new sees. Still more formidable was the hostility of the people generally, a hostility founded on fear, for the introduction of so many new bishops nominated by the king was looked upon as being the first step to prepare the way for the bringing in of the dreaded Spanish Inquisition. Already the edicts against heretics, which Charles V had enacted and severely enforced, were being carried out throughout the length and breadth of the land with increasing and merciless barbarity. Both papal and episcopal inquisitors were active in the work of persecution, and so many were the sentences that in many places the civil authorities, and even some of the stadholders, declined to carry out the executions. Public opinion looked upon Granvelle as the author of the new bishopric scheme and the instigator of the increased activity of the persecutors. He was accused of being eager to take any measures to repress the ancient liberties of the Netherland provinces and to establish a centralised system of absolute rule in order to ingratiate himself with the king and so to secure his own advancement. That the cardinal was ambitious of power there can be no question, but to men of Granvelle's great abilities as administrator and statesman, ambition is not necessarily a fault, and access to the secret records and correspondence of the time has revealed that the part played by him was far from being so sinister as believed. The Bishop of Arras was not consulted about the bishoprics proposal until after the papal bull had been secured, and at first he was unfavourable to it, and was not anxious to become archbishop and primate. It was his advice which led Margaret to send away the hated Spanish regiments from Netherland soil, and far from being naturally a relentless persecutor, there is proof that neither he nor the president of the Privy Council, the jurist Viglius, believed in the policy of harsh and brutal methods for stamping out heretical opinions. They had in this as in other matters to obey their master, and allow the odium to fall upon themselves. To Orange and Egmont, the two leaders of the opposition to Granvelle, a third name, that of Philip de Montmorency, Count of Hoorn and Admiral of Flanders, has now to be added. These three worked together for the overthrow of the cardinal, but their opposition at this time was based rather on political than on religious grounds. They all professed the Catholic faith, but the marriage of Orange in August of 1561 with a Lutheran, Anne, daughter of Maurice of Saxony and granddaughter of Philip of Hesse, was ominous of coming change in William's religious opinions. In 1562 the discontent of the nobles led to the formation of a league against the cardinal, of which, in addition to the three leaders, the Counts of Brederode, Mansfield and Hoogstraeten were the principal members. This league, of which Orange was the brain and moving spirit, had as its chief aim the removal of Granvelle from office and the redress of grievances. It found widespread support. The cardinal was assailed by a torrent of lampoons and pasquinades of the bitterest description. But though Margaret began to see that the unpopularity of the minister was undermining her position, and was rendering for her the task of government more and more difficult, Philip was obdurate and closed his ears. The long distance between Madrid and Brussels and the procrastinating habits of the Spanish king added immensely to the regent's perplexities. She could not act on her own initiative, and her appeals to Philip were either disregarded or, after long delay, met by evasive replies. The discontented nobles in vain tried to obtain redress for their grievances. In the autumn of 1562 Montigny was sent on a special mission to Madrid, but returned without effecting anything. Orange, Egmont and Hoorn thereupon drew a joint letter containing a bold demand for the dismissal of Granvelle as the chief cause of all the troubles in the land. The king replied by asking that one of them should go in person to Spain to discuss the grievances with him, and suggested that Egmont should be sent. Egmont, however, was averse to the proposal, and another and stronger letter signed by the three leaders was dispatched to Madrid. Finding that both Margaret and Granvelle himself were in agreement with Orange, Egmont and Hoorn in their view of the situation, Margaret advising with the cardinal's acquiescence the necessity of the minister's removal from his post, Philip determined at last that Granvelle should leave the Netherlands. But in accordance with the Council of Alva, who was opposed on principle to any concession, he characteristically employed circuitous and clandestine means to conceal from the world any appearance of yielding to the request of his subjects. In January 1564 he sent a letter to the Duchess of Parma expressing his displeasure at the Lords' letter, and saying that they must substantiate their complaints. The same messenger, Armenteros, the Duchess's secretary, carried another letter for Granvelle headed "Secret," in which the cardinal was told that, owing to the strong feeling that had been aroused against him, he was to ask permission from the regent to go away for a short time to visit his mother. About a week after these letters had reached their destination another courier brought a reply to the three nobles, which, though written on the same day as the others, bore a date 3 weeks later, in which they were bidden to take their places again in the Council of State, and a promise was given that the charges against Granvelle after substantiation should be maturely considered. This letter was delivered on March 1st, after Granvelle had already, in obedience with the king's orders, asked for a leave of absence to visit his mother in Franche-Comté. The cardinal had actually left Brussels on March 13th, to the great joy of every class of the people, never to return. With the departure of Granvelle, the nobles once more took their seats on the Council of State. The consulta disappeared, and the regent herself appeared to be relieved, and to welcome the disappearance of the man whose authority had overshadowed her own. But the change, though it placed large powers of administration and of patronage in the hands of the Netherlanders instead of foreigners, did not by any means introduce purer methods of government. Many of the nobles were heavily in debt, most of them were self-seeking, Offices and emoluments were eagerly sought for, and were even put up for sale. Armenteros, Margaret's private secretary, to whom the nickname of Argenteros was given, was the leading spirit in this disgraceful traffic, and enriched himself by the acceptance of bribes for the nomination to preferments. It was an unedifying state of things, and public opinion was not long in expressing its discontent with such an exhibition of widespread venality and greed. All this was duly reported to Philip by Granvelle, who continued in his retirement to keep himself well informed of all that was going on. Meanwhile, by the efforts of Orange, Egmont and Hoorn, chiefly of the former, proposals of reform were being urged for the strengthening of the powers of the Council of State, for the reorganisation of finance, and for the more moderate execution of the placards against heresy. While discussion concerning these matters was in progress, came an order from Philip, August 1564, for the enforcing of the decrees of recently concluded Council of Trent. This at once aroused protest and opposition. It was denounced as an infringement of the fundamental privileges of the provinces. Philip's instructions, however, were peremptory. In these circumstances it was resolved by the Council of State to dispatch Egmont on a special mission to Madrid to explain to the king in person the condition of affairs in the Netherlands. Egmont having expressed his willingness to go, instructions were drawn up for him by Viglius. When these were read at a meeting of the council convened for the purpose, Orange, in a long and eloquent speech, boldly expressed his dissent from much that Viglius had written, and wished that Philip should be plainly told that it was impossible to enforce the decrees, and that the severity of religious persecution must be moderated. The council determined to revise the instructions on the lines suggested by Orange, whose words had such an effect upon the aged Viglius that he had that very night a stroke of apoplexy, which proved fatal. Egmont set out for Spain January 15, 1565, and on his arrival was received by Philip with extreme courtesy and graciousness. He was entertained splendidly. Presents were made to him, which, being considerably in debt, he gladly accepted. But as regards his mission he was put off with evasions and blandishments, and he returned home with a reply from the king containing some vague promises of reform in financial and other matters, but an absolute refusal to modify the decrees against heresy. Rather would he sacrifice 100,000 lives, if he had them, than concede liberty of worship in any form. For some months, however, no attempt was made to carry out active persecutions, and the regent meanwhile did her utmost to place before the king urgent reasons for the modification of his policy, owing to the angry spirit of unrest and suspicion which was arising in the provinces. She begged Philip to visit the Netherlands and acquaint himself personally with the difficulties of a situation which, unless her advice were taken, would rapidly grow worse and pass beyond her control. Philip, however, was deaf alike to remonstrance or entreaty. On November 5, 1565, a royal despatch reached Brussels in which the strictest orders were renewed for the promulgation throughout the provinces of the decrees of the Council of Trent, and for the execution of the placards against heretics, while the proposals that had been made for an extension of the powers of the Council of State and for the summoning of the States General were refused. As soon as these fateful decisions were known, and the Inquisition began to set about its fell work in real earnest, the popular indignation knew no bounds. A large number of the magistrates refused to take any part in the cruel persecution that arose, following the example of Orange, Egmont, Burgon, and others of the stadholders and leading nobles. A strong spirit of opposition to arbitrary and foreign rule arose and found expression in the action taken by a large number of the members of the so-called lesser nobility. Many of these had come to Brussels, and at a meeting at the house of the Count of Culemburg the formation of a league to resist arbitrary rule was proposed. The leaders were Louis of Nassau, brother of the Prince of Orange, Nicholas de Harnes, Philip de Marnix, Lord of St. Aldegonde, and Henry Viscount of Brederode. Other meetings were held, and a document embodying the principles and demands of the confederates was drawn up, known as the Compromise, which was widely distributed among the nobles and quickly obtained large and constantly increasing support. The signatories of the Compromise, while professing themselves to be faithful and loyal subjects of the king, denounced the Inquisition in its every form as being unjust and contrary to all laws human and divine, and they pledged themselves to stand by one another in resisting its introduction into the Netherlands and in preventing the carrying out of the placards against heresy, while at the same time undertaking to maintain the royal authority and public peace in the land. At first the great nobles stood aloof, doubtful which course to pursue. At the instigation of Orange, conferences were held, at which, by his advice, a petition or request, setting forth the grievances and asking for redress, should be made in writing for presentation to the regent. The original draft of this document was the work of Lewis of Nassau. These conferences, however, revealed that there was a considerable divergence of views among the leading nobles. Egmont and Meghem were indeed so alarmed at the character of the movement, which seemed to them to savour of treason, that they separated themselves henceforth from Orange and Hoorn, and openly took the side of the government. The Duchess, after some demur, agreed to receive the petition. A body of confederates, under the leadership of Brederode and Lewis of Nassau, marched to the palace, where they were received by Margaret in person. The petitioners asked the regent to send an envoy to Madrid to lay before the king the state of feeling among his loyal subjects in the Netherlands, praying him to withdraw the Inquisition and moderate the placards against heresy, and meanwhile, by her own authority, to suspend them until the king's answer had been received. The regent replied that she had no power to suspend the Inquisition or the placards, but would undertake, while awaiting the royal reply, to mitigate their operation. On the last day of their stay at Brussels, April 8th, the confederates, under the presidency of Brederode, to the number of about 300, dined together at the Hotel Culemborg. In the course of the meal Brederode drew the attention of the company, now somewhat excited with wine, to a contemptuous phrase attributed by common report to Barlaymont. Margaret was somewhat perturbed at the formidable numbers of the deputation as it entered the palace court, and it was said that Barlaymont remarked that these beggars, c'est Dieu, need cause her no fear. Brederode declared that he had no objection to the name, and was quite willing to be a beggar in the cause of his country and his king. It was destined to be a name famous in history. Immediately loud cries arose from the assembled guests, until the great hall echoed with the shouts of "Vivent les gueux!" From this date onward the confederates were known as les gueux, and they adopted a coarse grey dress with the symbols of beggarhood, the wallet and the bowl, worn as the insignia of their league. It was the beginning of a popular movement, which made rapid headway among all classes. A medal was likewise struck, which bore on one side the head of the king, on the other two clasped hands with the inscription "Fidèles au roi jusqu'à la besace." Thus was the opposition to the tyrannical measures of the government organising itself in the spring of 1566. It is a great mistake to suppose that the majority of those who signed the compromise or presented the request were disloyal to their sovereign or converts to the reformed faith. Among those who denounced the methods of the Inquisition and of the blood placards were a large number who, without ceasing to be Catholics, had been disillusioned by the abuses which had crept into the Roman Church, desired their removal only to a less degree than the Protestants themselves, and had no sympathy with the terrible and remorseless persecution on Spanish lines, which sought to crush out all liberty of thought and all efforts of religious reform by the stake and the sword of the executioner. Nevertheless, this league of the nobles gave encouragement to the sectaries, and was the signal for a great increase in the number and activity of the Calvinist and Zwinglian preachers, who flocked into the land from the neighbouring countries. Such was the boldness of these preachers that, instead of being contented with secret meetings, they began to hold their conventicles in the fields or in the outskirts of the towns. Crowds of people thronged to hear them, and the authority of the magistrates was defied and flouted. The regent was in despair. Shortly after the presentation of the request, it was determined by the advice of the council to send special envoys to lay before the king once more the serious state of things. The Marquis of Berghen and Baron Montigny consented with some demur to undertake the mission, but for various reasons they did not reach Madrid until 2 months later. They were received with apparent courtesy, and after several conferences the king, on July 31st, dispatched a letter to Margaret in which he undertook to do away with the papal inquisition, and offered to allow such moderation of the placards as did not imply any recognition of heretical opinions or any injury to the Catholic faith. He refused to consent to the meeting of the States, but he sent letters couched in most friendly terms to Orange and Egmont, appealing to their loyalty and asking them to support the regent by their advice and influence. These demonstrations of a conciliatory temper were, however, mere temporising. He was playing false. A document is in existence, dated August 9th, in which Philip states that these concessions had been extorted from him against his will, and that he did not regard himself as bound by them, and he informed the Pope that the abolition of the Papal Inquisition was a mere form of words. Meanwhile events were moving fast in the Netherlands. The open-air preachings were attended by thousands, and at Antwerp, which was one of the chief centres of Calvinism, disorders broke out, and armed conflicts were feared. Orange himself, as Burgrave of Antwerp, at the request of the Duchess, visited the town, and with the aid of Brederode and Meghem succeeded in effecting a compromise between the Catholic and Protestant parties. The latter were allowed to hold their preachings undisturbed so long as they met outside and not within the city walls. The regent, in her alarm, was even driven to make overtures to the confederates to assist her in the maintenance of order. There was much parleying, in which Orange and Egmont took part, and in July an assembly of the signatories of the compromise was called together at Saint Trond in the district of Liège. Some 2,000 were present, presided over by Lewis of Nassau. It was resolved to send 12 delegates to Margaret to lay before her the necessity of finding a remedy for the evils which were afflicting and disturbing the land. They offered to consult with Orange and Egmont as to the best means by which they could work together for the country's good, but hinting that, if no redress was given, they might be forced to look for foreign aid. Indeed, this was no empty threat, for Lewis had already been in communication with the Protestant leaders both in France and in the Rhinelands as to the terms on which they would furnish armed assistance, and Orange was probably not altogether in ignorance of the fact. The regent was angry at the tone of the delegates whom she received on July 26, but in her present impotence thought it best to dissemble. She promised to give consideration to the petition, and summoned a meeting of the Knights of the Golden Fleece to meet at Brussels on August 18th, when she would decide upon her answer. But when that date arrived, other and more pressing reasons than the advice of counsellors compelled her to yield to the confederates a large part of their demands. On August 23 she agreed, in return for help in the restoration of order, to concede liberty of preaching, so long as those who assembled did not bear arms and did not interfere with the Catholic places of worship and religious services. Further, an indemnity was promised to all who had signed the compromise. The reasons which influenced her were first the receipt on August 12 of the conciliatory letter from the king, to which reference has already been made, in which he consented to a certain measure of toleration, and secondly a sudden outburst of iconoclastic fury on the part of the Calvinist sectaries, which had spread with great rapidity through many parts of the land. On August 14, at Saint Omer yprès Courtrai Valenciennes and Tournai, fanatical mobs entered the churches, destroying and wrecking, desecrating the altars, images, vestments, and works of art, and carrying away the sacred vessels and all that was valuable. On August 16th and 17th, the Cathedral of Antwerp was entered by infuriated and sacrilegious bands armed with axes and hammers, who made havoc and ruin of the interior of the beautiful church. In Holland and Zeeland similar excesses were committed. Such conduct aroused a feeling of the deepest indignation and reprobation in the minds of all right-thinking men, and alienated utterly those more moderate Catholics who up until now had been in favour of moderation. Of the great nobles who had hitherto upheld the cause of the national liberties and privileges against the encroachments of a foreign despotism, many now fell away. Among these were Aremberg, Meghem, and Mansfeld. Egmont hesitated. As might have been expected, the news of the outrages, when it reached Philip's ears, filled him with rage and grief, and he is reported to have exclaimed, "It shall cost them dear, I swear it by the soul of my father." From this time forward he was determined to visit with exemplary punishment not only the rioters and the Protestant sectaries, but more especially the great nobles on whose shoulders he laid the whole blame for the troubles that had arisen. He was in no hurry to act, and announced that it was his intention to go to the Netherlands in person and inquire into the alleged grievances. So he told his counsellors and wrote to Margaret. No one seems to have suspected his deep-laid scheme for allaying the suspicions of his intended victims until the right moment came for laying his hands upon them and crushing all opposition by overwhelming force. Orange alone, who had his paid spies at Madrid, had a presage of what was coming and took measures of precaution betimes. An intercepted letter from the Spanish ambassador at Paris to the regent Margaret specifically mentioned Orange, Egmont and Hoorn as deserving of exemplary punishment, and on October 3 the prince arranged a meeting at Dendermonde to consider what should be their course of action. In addition to Egmont and Hoorn, Hoogstraeten and Lewis of Nassau were present. William and Lewis urged that steps should be taken for preparing armed resistance should the necessity arise, but neither Egmont nor Hoorn would consent. They would not be guilty of any act of disloyalty to their sovereign. The result of the meeting was a great disappointment to Orange, and this date marked a turning point in his life. In concert with his brothers, John and Lewis, he began to enter into negotiations with several of the German Protestant princes for the formation of a league for the protection of the adherents of the Reformed faith in the Netherlands. Now, for the first time, he severed his nominal allegiance to the Roman Church, and in a letter to Philip of Hesse avowed himself a Lutheran. During these same autumn months Philip furnished his sister with considerable sums of money for the levying of a strong mercenary force, German and Walloon. Possessed now of a body of troops that she could trust, Margaret, in the spring of 1567, took energetic steps to suppress all insurrectionary movements and disorders, and did not scruple to disregard the concessions which had been wrung from her on August 23. The Confederate nobles, satisfied with her promises, had somewhat prematurely dissolved their league, but one of the most fiery and zealous among them, Jean de Marny, Lord of Toulouse, collected at Antwerp a body of some 2,000 Calvinists and attempted to make himself master of that city. At Oosterweel he was encountered, on March 13, by a Walloon force despatched by Margaret with orders to exterminate the heretics. Toulouse and almost the whole of his following perished in the fight. In the south, at the same time, the conventicles were mercilessly suppressed and the preachers driven into exile. Margaret now felt herself strong enough to demand that the stadholders and leading nobles should, on pain of dismissal from their posts, take an oath to serve the king and to act for and against whomever his majesty might order. Egmont took the oath. Hoorn, Hoogstraeten and Brederode declined to do so, and resigned their offices. Orange offered his resignation, but Margaret was unwilling to accept it, and urged him to discuss the matter first with Egmont and Meghem. The three nobles met accordingly at Willebroek, April 2. William used his utmost powers of persuasion in an attempt to convince Egmont that he was courting destruction, but in vain. He himself was not to be moved from his decision, and the two friends, who had worked together so long in the patriot cause, parted, never to meet again. Orange saw that he was no longer safe in the Netherlands, and on April 22 he set out from Breda for the residence of his brother John at Dillenburg. Here in exile he could watch in security the progress of events, and be near at hand should circumstances again require his intervention in the affairs of the Netherlands. Orange did not take this extreme step without adequate cause. At the very time that he left the Netherlands, Philip was taking leave of the Duke of Alva, whom he was dispatching at the head of a veteran force to carry out, without pity or remorse, the stern duty of expelling heresy from the provinces and punishing all those, and especially the leaders, who had ventured to oppose the arbitrary exercise of the royal authority. He had for some time been preparing this expedition. He still kept up the pretence that he was coming in person to inquire into the alleged grievances, but he never had the slightest intention of quitting Madrid. Alva sailed from Cartagena, April 27, for Genoa, and proceeded at once to draw together from the various Spanish garrisons in Italy a picked body of some 12,000 men. With these he set out in June for his long march across the Alps and through Burgundy, Lorraine and Luxemburg. His progress, jealously watched by the French and Swiss, met with no opposition save for the difficulties of the route. He entered the Netherlands on August 8 with his army intact. A number of notables, amongst whom was Egmont, came to meet him on his way to Brussels. He received them, more particularly Egmont, with every appearance of graciousness. Alva as yet bore only the title of Captain General, But the king had bestowed on him full powers civil and military, and the Duchess of Parma, though still nominally regent, found herself reduced to a nonentity. Alva's first step was to place strong Spanish garrisons in the principal cities; his next, to get the leaders who had been marked for destruction into his power. To effect this he succeeded by fair and flattering words in securing the presence of both Egmont and Hoorn at Brussels. Under the pretence of taking part in a consultation, they were, September 9th, invited to the Duke's residence, and on their arrival suddenly found themselves arrested. At the same time their secretaries and papers were seized, and Antony van Stralen, the burgomaster of Antwerp, was placed under arrest. These high-handed actions were the prelude to a reign of terror, and Margaret, already humiliated by finding herself superseded, requested her brother to accept her resignation. On October 6th the office of Governor-General was conferred upon Alva, and shortly afterwards the Duchess left the Netherlands and returned to Parma. Alva had now the reins of power in his hand, and with a relentless zeal and cold-blooded ferocity which have made his name a byword, he set about the accomplishment of the fell task with which his master had entrusted him. He had to enforce with drastic rigour all the penalties decreed by the placards against heretics and preachers, and to deal summarily with all who had taken any part in opposition to the government. But to attempt to do this by means of the ordinary courts and magistrates would consume time and lead to many acquittals. Alva therefore had no sooner thrown off the mask by the sudden and skilfully planned arrest of Egmont and Hoorn than he proceeded to erect an extraordinary tribunal, which had no legal standing except such as the arbitrary will of the Duke conferred upon it. This so-called Council of Troubles, which speedily acquired in popular usage the name of the Council of Blood, virtually consisted of Alva himself, who was president and to whose final decision all cases were referred, and two Spanish lawyers, his chosen tools and agents, Juan de Vargas and Luis del Rio. The two royalist nobles, Noircarmes and Barlaymont, and 5 Netherland jurists also had seats, but as only the Spaniards voted, the others before long ceased to attend the meetings. The proceedings indeed were from the legal point of view a mere travesty of justice. A whole army of commissioners was let loose upon the land, and informers were encouraged and rewarded. Multitudes of accused were hauled before the tribunal and condemned by batches almost without the form of a trial. For long hours, day by day, Vargas and del Rio revelled in their work of butchery, and in all parts of the Netherlands the executioners were busy. It was of no use for the accused to appeal to the charters and privileges of their provinces. All alike were summoned to Brussels. Non curamus privilegios vestros, declared Vargas in his ungrammatical Latin. Hand in hand with the wholesale sentences of death went the confiscation of property. Vast sums went into the treasury. The whole land for a while was terror-stricken. All organised opposition was crushed, and no one dared to raise his voice in protest. The Prince of Orange was summoned to appear in person before the council within 6 weeks, under pain of perpetual banishment and confiscation of his estates. He refused to come, and energetically denied that the council had any jurisdiction over him. The same sentence was passed upon all other leaders who had placed themselves out of reach of Alva's arm: St. Aldegond, Hoogstraeten, Culemburg, Montigny, Lewis of Nassau, and others. Unable to lay hands upon the prince himself, the Governor-General took dastardly advantage of William's indiscretion in leaving his eldest son at Louvain to pursue his studies at the university. At the beginning of 1568, Philip William, Count of Buren at the right of his mother, was seized and sent to Madrid to be brought up at the court of Philip to hate the cause to which his father henceforth devoted his life. Already, indeed, before the abduction of his son, Orange from his safe retreat at Dillenburg had been exerting himself to raise troops for the invasion of the Netherlands. He still professed loyalty to the king, and declared that in the king's name he wished to restore to the provinces those liberties and privileges which Philip himself had sworn that he would maintain. The difficulty was to find the large sum of money required for such an enterprise, and it was only by extraordinary efforts that a sufficient amount was obtained. Part of the money was collected in Antwerp and various towns of Holland and Zeeland, the rest subscribed by individuals. John of Nassau pledged his estates, Orange sold his plate and jewels, and finally a war chest of 200,000 florins was gathered together. It was proposed to attack the Netherlands from 3 directions. From the north, Lewis of Nassau was to lead an army from the Ems into Friesland, Hoogstraeten on the east to effect an entrance by way of Maestricht, while another force of Huguenots and refugees in the south was to march into Artois. It was an almost desperate scheme in the face of veteran troops in a central position under such a tried commander as Alva. The last named French force and that under Hoogstraeten were easily defeated and scattered by Spanish detachments sent to meet them. Lewis of Nassau was at first more successful. Entering Groningen at the head of 8,000 or 9,000 undisciplined troops, he was attacked, May 23, in a strong position behind a morass by a Spanish force under the Count of Aremberg, stadholder of Friesland, at Heiligerlee. He gained a complete victory. Aremberg himself was slain, as was the younger brother of Lewis, Adolphus of Nassau. The triumph of the invaders was of short duration. Alva himself took in hand the task of dealing with the rebels. At the head of 15,000 troops he drove before him the levies of Nassau to Gemmingen on the estuary of the Ems, and here with the loss of only 7 men he completely annihilated them. Lewis himself and a few others alone escaped by throwing themselves into the river and swimming for their lives. The action at Heiligerlee, by compelling the Governor-General to take the field, had hastened the fate of Egmont and Hoorn. After their arrest, the 2 noblemen were kept in solitary confinement in the citadel of Ghent for several months, while the long list of charges against them was being examined by the Council of Troubles, in other words, by Vargas and Del Rio. These charges they angrily denied, and great efforts were made on their behalf by the wife of Egmont and the Dowager Countess of Hoorn. Appeals were made to the Governor-General and to Philip himself, either for pardon on the grounds of services rendered to the state, or at least for a trial as Knights of the Golden Fleece before the court of the order. The Emperor Maximilian himself pleaded with Philip for clemency, but without avail. Their doom had been settled in advance, and the king was inflexible. Alva accordingly determined that they should be executed before he left Brussels for his campaign in the north. On June 2, the council, refusing to hear any further evidence in the prisoners' favour, pronounced them guilty of high treason, and Alva at once signed the sentence of death. Egmont and Hoorn the next day were brought by a strong detachment of troops from Ghent to Brussels, and were confined in a building opposite the town hall, known as the Broodhuis. On June 5 their heads were struck off upon a scaffold erected in the great square before their place of confinement. Both of them met their death with the utmost calmness and courage. The effect of this momentous stroke of vengeance upon these 2 patriot leaders, both of them good Catholics, who had always professed loyalty to their sovereign, and one of whom, Egmont, had performed distinguished services for his country and king, was profound. A wave of mingled rage and sorrow swept over the land. It was not only an act of cruel injustice, but even as an act of policy, a blunder of the first magnitude, which was sure to bring, as it did bring, retribution in its train. End of chapter 3.